Okay, so welcome back, everyone, and we're now going to kick off the final plenary session for the GFBR. The title is Futures Reimagining Health Research Partnerships. I'm Swaleha from Pakistan, and I have
Joe Ali from USA.
Yeah, okay. All right. So very briefly to introduce the session and our wonderful speakers over here. We're trying to imagine different possibilities for future health partnerships now that we've talked about the past, we've talked about the present right now, and as Cesar spoke about in his keynote, we now have to think of various ways how we can reimagine or be as creative as possible as we imagine our future. So we have 3 talks in today's session. We have Dr. Nadia from Ghana, and who will talk about decoloniality as pathway to ensure equitable research partnerships. And she will argue that decolonization requires systematic efforts to address inherent power asymmetries. Then we have Prakarti from USA, who will discuss findings from her doctoral research on how international funding mechanisms, something which we've been talking about quite a lot, often disadvantage researchers from research ecosystems in the global south. And she will propose ways through which health research partnerships can evolve if funders were to embrace equity, not only as a tokenistic gesture, but rather as a structural commitment. And unfortunately, our third speaker, Mona Nasir from UK, is not here. She is terribly unwell, but we will be playing her recorded video, and her co-author will be happy to answer any questions during the plenary discussion. And Mona invites us to reimagine different possible future avenues and through her Metafuturism Lab project. Okay, so we will give it to Dr. Nadia. Joe, do you want to say something?
No. Just kidding.
Oh.
Thank you. Thank you, Swaleha, and thank you, Joe, as well. Last theme for the meeting. So I'm going to start off this. Is that okay? All right. So I'm going to start off this session with some conceptual reflections, and then it will be followed up with some of the case studies as we are reimagining futures for equitable research partnership. And this has been drawn from work that we have done over the past few years. First in managing consortia, or managing partnership, and also in decolonizing and global health research. And so as we begin to reimagine or think about ways to reimagine partnerships, I'm going to focus on decoloniality as a pathway to equitable partnerships. So yesterday, during our group work, one of our members said something. She said, there's no way you can do research without collaborations, and I think that's very definitive. And it's even more critical now because of the current global health climate in which we find ourselves. And we cannot overemphasize the gains of partnerships. We've said many things around it in this past 2 days. But we are also hugely aware of the challenges that we face in our partnerships. And since yesterday, we've been discussing quite a number of them. And it's extremely important for us to know how to navigate some of the tensions. And that is why we're gathered here as we think about reimagining. We've talked about power imbalances. We've talked about different types of inequities. Over the past, perhaps decade or a few more years than that, there have been increasing efforts to address some of the challenges that we've been talking about. Power imbalance as an example within partnerships. For instance, there have been mandated South-led partnerships. Some of the previous speakers alluded to that. Sometimes joint leadership in some of the partnerships. And even funders have instituted quotas for the different partners within partnerships as a way of addressing some of these inequities, and also ensure that capacity strengthening is a part of many of the research projects. But in spite, and if looking at this slide here, Delta's Africa initiative is one such example. It is supported by Wellcome and the FCDO, but it was aimed to shift the center of gravity of African science to the African continent. And so it supported about 11 consortia in the first phase and about 14 in the second phase with about $170 million. These consortia were not only led by, but heavily African as a way of achieving that aim. And if you look, it's not quite clear here, but at the extreme end, Gordon Awandari, Prof. Awandari, who was here yesterday, is one of the Delta's Africa leaders. But in spite of the many or increasing efforts and measures that have been made to be able to address these, we still grapple with many ethical challenges. Again, since yesterday, we've been discussing quite a number of them. So these arrangements, so for instance, mandated South-led partnerships, do these changes or arrangements meaningfully reflect in the operations or the ethos of the partnerships? Again, there's so much emphasis on North-South partnerships, but there are several other partnerships that are being overlooked, but that grapple with these same issues. South-South partnerships within countries, partnerships between researchers and communities, or with other types of non-academic collaborators. And yet, yesterday, Caesar indicated this. He said that the actors have changed, but the systems remain the same. The work on consortium management that I did assessed many of the Delta's Africa consortia, examined their consortium management practices around governance, around management. And it highlighted so many different types of inequities, complex intersectionalities of different drivers of inequities in the members within these partnerships. And so you realize that the issues remain the same so long as you have different power disparities within the partnerships. And again, just the session before this, we talked about the role of the broader geopolitical or socioeconomic power structures within which we find ourselves, within which global health exists, and within which these partnerships also operate, which serves as constraints in our efforts towards equitable partnerships. So decoloniality acts not just as a critique, but a way of reimagining partnership. It examines how the legacies of colonial power structures, as well as ways of doing, continue to shape our present-day operations or our present-day systems, whether it's reflected within or between communities, within or between institutions, countries, continents, and it serves as a lens for examining many of these to lead us towards reimagining. And so I'm going to explore, I'd want us all to reflect 4 interrelational concepts, decolonial concepts, and how they are relevant in our effort to reimagine partnerships. The first is decentering. Yesterday, 2 terms were highlighted here: center and periphery. Are there actors who are constantly in the center? Are there actors who are constantly in the periphery? Do these change? Why do we even have it in the first place? And so it's important to indicate, and that's what decentering advances. It advances the idea that we should be moving away from one dominant viewpoint. And so there shouldn't be a dominant epistemology within our research partnerships. No one group should have the power to determine what qualifies as knowledge, which knowers are valued, or which methods of knowing are considered valid. And so as we reflect on our research partnerships, some of the thinking around it is around the methodologies, the frameworks that we use. Are they from a single viewpoint? Are they from a single tradition? Are they should they be considered universal? And those are some of the questions that we need to ask. The second is pluriversality. During the keynotes, we heard a little bit about that. But simply put, we acknowledge that there are diverse ways of being, of knowing, and of doing. And all of those diverse ways are equally valid. And again, during Thal's presentation in a previous session, she was asking some questions. Who qualifies as a partner? And so how diverse is our thinking around who qualifies as a partner in research partnerships, or even what a makeup of a research partnership is, and what models guide our research, or the ways in which we develop our partnerships. And what we call acceptable scientific inquiry, for instance, is it based on a single viewpoint? For instance, a Eurocentric tradition. Have we considered the diverse types of traditions in terms of knowing? And so these are some of the considerations that I would want us to make as we think about reimagining. The third is epistemic justice, and so simply the right of all stakeholders to shape the knowledge systems that affect them, so that local knowledge is not undervalued or extracted. And so we want to ask, are local knowers, and I know we can get into definitions, but using it in a very simplistic form here, local knowers true partners from conception to application? Are they empowered to exercise their intellectual agency? And the question is, are local communities just the subject of the narratives when it comes to our research, or they are actually the authors of those narratives? And the final one is self-determination, the power of beneficiary communities to determine their own knowledge needs and solutions. Whose voice carries weight in setting agenda, for instance, whose priorities are centered, and if there are partners, external partners, or even funders, how do they align? And so in terms of reflecting on these concepts, how do we operationalize them? We first need to start by unpacking and trying to understand them and their relevance in our work as researchers, but also within our research partnerships, and understand that it requires action at different levels, individual levels, community levels, all the way to global levels. And yes, there have been some incremental efforts over the years to bring change, but because of how structural and deeply rooted some of these issues are, we require radical measures as well, and bold action to be able to bring change. And as part of our work, we developed a framework to help or contribute to the thinking around practical steps for decolonial action. And it starts with an increase in the consciousness of the legacies of coloniality within research and partnerships. And then once we identify them, we have the ability now to challenge the existing assumptions and practices and bring us into a space where we can envision different futures, which will then be based on move towards action that are based on these visioning. And if you look at this slide, I don't expect that you read everything on the slide, but the top left yellow box is also part of the work that we did in that same paper. It presents a tool which brings or presents some questions, reflexive questions to ask ourselves, not just as individuals, but as institutions, to be able to start rethinking our practice. And so I will just give an example of one of the questions for institutions, which asks that, so what types of knowledge production processes are considered as acceptable by an institution, and what is the basis for that choice? So that's just an example. And the rest of the boxes there also show work or practical tools that have been published by other authors as well to help in the thinking, to help us operationalize these thoughts. And so yesterday, this was re-echoed here a number of times, that sometimes we know the right thing to do, but it's challenging to put it in practice. And the constraints within which we operate makes it complex. It starts even from our individual or at the personal level, sometimes our own mindset. Yesterday, Caesar said that we need to master our own power. And those are some of the constraints, all the way until to global level constraints. But we need to keep making progress. It needs to be a continuous process. It's a shared responsibility, whether one is considered dominant or marginalized. It's a shared responsibility. We need to have open discussions, and we need to be transparent about our interests. And as we assess and as we review and we work towards change, we need to be able to be open and embrace the change that is coming. So I want to end with this last slide here. It's a quote that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It says that if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. I want to add that in the current climate in which we find ourselves, it may be extremely challenging or even impossible to go at all if we don't shape our partnerships in ways that are equitable. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nadia, for the really fantastic presentation and a good introduction to this session today. I'm now going to invite Prakriti Shrestha to come up to the podium and share her talk on opportunities for funders to support equitable research partnerships. Prakriti.
Hello, everyone. Can anyone hear me? All good? Okay. So hi, I'm Prakriti Shrestha. I'm originally from Nepal, but have been living in the US for some time. I recently completed my PhD from Johns Hopkins on the topic of how funders can better support equitable partnerships. And today I'll be talking specifically about opportunities for funders to support equitable partnerships in the future. From the discussions we've had in the last couple of days, I also wanted to sort of add at the beginning that we've talked about a really diverse range of partnerships, and in my presentation, I'll be focusing on a somewhat narrower view of partnerships, specifically looking at just high-income country to low-income country, low-middle-income country collaborations, and also talking specifically about high-income country funders. I am sure that a lot of these concepts and elements will be applicable in your own context, so I invite you to reflect on these elements as I'm presenting. So as Nadia has already laid out really nicely in her presentation, partnerships continue to remain structurally unequal. They continue to reproduce inequities that are rooted in colonial histories and the global political economy. And today, I focus on how high-income country funders and institutions shape these dynamics. Among all the different actors that influence partnerships, funders, I think, play a particularly powerful role. A colleague at Makerere summed it up quite perfectly. They said, the one who holds the money is the one who most of you are going to dance to. And in particular, I think funders are really important because they are central in shaping global health agendas. They have social and capital resources to set expectations that carry financial implications, hold partners accountable from the outset of a funded project, and also monitor their commitments throughout. They also have the ability to communicate normative viewpoints and to fund activities that are explicitly meant to foster more equitable research priorities. And in the literature, you see scholars have also argued that funders have a moral responsibility toward advancing equity in partnerships. And I think despite the acknowledgement that funders play a really important role, funders are rarely the subject of accountability or ethical reflection, just in terms of the practical challenges of maybe being able to hold them accountable. And while funders have also made many rhetorical commitments to equity and inclusivity, their practices do often fall short, leaving LMIC institutions under-resourced, under-recognized, and underrepresented. And to sort of explore the ethical issues and possible recommendations for funders, I drew on my doctoral research that used a multi-method design to examine how funders support or undermine partnership equity. I conducted a scoping review of existing partnership equity toolkits and frameworks that are sort of aimed to be used by funders. I also did a critical discourse analysis of 3 US funder documents, NIH, USAID, and Gates. During the course of my dissertation writing, a lot of these documents did disappear from public view. NIH documents were taken off the internet. USAID obviously was shut down. But I think it's still relevant to discuss where US funders were going at this time. And finally, I also did a qualitative case study of the longstanding partnership between Johns Hopkins and Makerere University. So much of what I discuss comes from this research, but I also, draw on some examples outside of these funders and partners that I mentioned. And you may also have your own examples, experiences that come to your mind. So across my research, I sort of was reflecting on where we might go or where we might tell funders to go. And I identified 3 opportunity spaces for funders to advance equity. And they are financing, governance, and accountability. And I'll briefly walk through what I was thinking for each of these. So for financing, I think is an area where maybe inequity is perhaps the most visible. A major issue is indirect cost rates. A stark example is that NIH caps indirect cost rates for LMICs at 8% compared to US institutions receiving up to 60%. And I think this disparity is rooted in a really long-standing mistrust of LMIC institutions' ability to manage funds, a perception that really persists despite strong evidence of their financial and administrative capacity. And I think this results in LMICs not being able to sustain research infrastructure, and it really reinforces dependence because they are not getting sufficient resources to kind of build that sustainable long-term infrastructure. It's not all bleak. I think some funders have slightly better indirect rate policies. For example, Gates allows 10%, European Commission 25%, Welcome 20%, and I'm sure there are others, but I think this progress remains quite uneven. One initiative that has stood out to me is the Good Financial Grant Practice, or GFGP, developed by the African Academy of Sciences, which some of you might be much more familiar with than I am, but from what I've seen, it helps standardize financial management systems, aims to eliminate redundancies and strengthen funders' confidence, ideally enabling LMIC institutions to negotiate fairer overheads and receive funds directly. And historically, funding has flowed primarily from HIC institutions as prime awardees, but this is changing. Programs like the NIH D43 mechanisms and EDCTP grants are increasingly supporting LMIC-led projects. USAID, before its dissolution, had also committed to directing 25% of its funding to local partners. However, especially as we've seen recently, these gains are quite fragile. As Brenda illustrated beautifully with the South Africa example and in the earlier thematic session, these shifting political priorities and declining overseas development assistance really create some uncertainty and precarity. We've seen the sort of devastating impacts when funding was pulled out, and we continue to see changes that will definitely affect how global health partnerships operate in the future. And this was mentioned earlier as well, but NIH's 2025 restructuring that eliminated foreign subawards, requiring foreign institutions to apply as separate project components, could have negative impacts like increased administrative burden, but maybe there's also potential to strengthen LMIC institutions' negotiating position. I think the real impact needs to be seen, and I think some of you with active NIH grants might be able to speak more on how it's affected your projects right now. And I think beyond just US funders, there's declining aid from all over the world, and so shifting philanthropic priorities that sustain or threaten the sustainability of direct LMIC funding, highlighting the need to institutionalize reforms that can withstand these external shocks. So kind of speaking to the resiliency of global health partnerships. So the next area I want to talk about is governance, which I think determines whose kind of voices shape research from agenda setting to implementation. I'll just kind of show like one example that we can quantify for governance. So the purple figure here shows that leadership of funder boards remains dominated by high-income countries. About 80% of these seats at major funders were held by people from high-income countries, compared to just 3.6% of seats held by low-income countries. And supposedly, this might be an improvement from what we have seen over the last few years. For example, there was almost a doubling of the percentage of nonprofit CEOs and board chairs from LMICs in 2025 compared to 2020. Given that HICs make up only about 17% of the world's population, it's interesting to see how still overrepresented they are at these crucial decision-making levels. And at a partnership-specific level, we see some funders moving towards sort of shared leadership models. So I think Fogarty mechanisms encourage multiple PI structures with LMIC co-leads. EDCTP funds LMIC-led trials, and I think these are promising examples, but importantly, I think they remain voluntary. I don't think they're the dominant model. They're inconsistent and sometimes tokenistic as well. And I wanted to talk about accountability because this is perhaps the most transformative opportunity we have, but I think maybe also the most challenging to operationalize. Currently, accountability is largely flowing in one direction, where research institutions are reporting extensively to funders through compliance mechanisms, while funders' equity commitments remain voluntary. They're not really monitored by anyone, and they can't really be enforced. It's up to their goodwill. And I think this asymmetry leaves research partners with little recourse when equity is neglected. So ideally, what I would like to see is a reciprocal or mutual accountability to really foster trust between funders, institutions, communities, and other actors in partnerships. Practically, I think this could look like developing bidirectional mechanisms, maybe things like equity metrics, mutual reporting systems, where both funders and research partners assess partnership equity. For example, these metrics could capture, the proportion of total grant funds retained at LMIC institutions, or the percentage of LMIC-led projects, or percentage of LMIC senior or last authors. And I think some funders have been trying to incorporate equity-related metrics. For instance, USAID, again, they don't exist anymore, but they had set a target that by 2030, at least half of its programs would create space for local actors to exercise leadership over priority setting. There are also existing toolkits and frameworks that highlight domains for both quantitative and qualitative evaluation. This includes things like agenda setting, intellectual property, capacity strengthening, community engagement. And you may also have touched on this particular topic in our breakout groups yesterday during sort of the responsibility and accountability thematic session. And someone in my group, we had this discussion about the idea of maybe an international governing body who could hold different actors accountable in a partnership. And while I'm not quite sure how to operationalize mutual accountability, I personally think that there's a lot of power in collective action, and we need to leverage our collective power as a research community to hold all actors, including funders, accountable. So I propose, somewhat idealistically and somewhat pragmatically, two key directions for funders. First, to embed equity into financing and governance mechanisms, ensuring parity in indirect costs, direct LMIC funding, and co-governance mandates across all stages of the research process. And the second, perhaps more idealistically, to find a way to institutionalize reciprocal or mutual accountability, like I mentioned, through equity metrics, mutual reporting, and community oversight. And I think this shift would help transform funders from gatekeepers into enablers of fair and resilient partnerships. And so I leave with you my vision for the future. At the heart of this conversation is really an ethical reimagining of funders' roles. Where funders are not just neutral financiers, they are actors within the moral community of partnership whose decisions shape power, voice, and inclusion. Because I don't think equity can rely on goodwill. It must be built into systems through rules, incentives, accountability, and shared authority. And I think when funders embrace this role, we move towards partnerships that reflect fairness, inclusion, and long-term sustainability. So I think, in my view, the future of equitable research partnerships depends on whether we can transform funder commitments into structural expectations. And with that, I will end the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Prakriti, for that presentation. I'm sure there'll be some questions and comments in our discussion. We, as was mentioned previously, we now have a recorded presentation from Mona Nasser, who, as was mentioned, is unfortunately ill and wasn't able to travel to join us. And so she did her best, I think, from her bed to record, more or less, to record a presentation for us. So we'll ask the team to maybe cue that up. I'm not sure.
I apologize for not being there. Unfortunately, I became quite sick before the trip, and I wasn't able to travel. However, fortunately, my colleague Pamela Kicilik is there, and hopefully she can bring in some of the issues and conversation we had in the breakout conversation that you will have in person there. And so the project we are talking about today is called the Metafuturism Lab. It's a project about speculative futures. What we do in this project, we co-create stories of alternative future. We try to embrace the different culture, traditions, and disciplines that exist, but we do it very consciously. That we also integrate. We very consciously integrate uncertainty of scientific knowledge, and we don't give the false impression of any certainty in scientific knowledge in the future. These are some photos of some of the workshops that we have organized across the world in Asia, America, Australia, and Europe. And we have run, I think, around 17, or it might have increased now from 2018 across the world. And we had very different type of people involved in the workshops. The storylines are, one of them, there are different storylines. Some of them have been evolving over countries and disciplines. The first storyline one is called the Mars mission was, it actually started, the whole project started off, I wanted to write a paper around the future of clinical stars in space medicine, because I was working with the European Astronaut Center, and I thought there's not enough conversation about innovating the methods. But we ended up actually running it as a workshop before we wrote the paper, that we got people, consultants, doctors, nurses in Torbay Hospital together, imagining their Mars and designing clinical research. And from day one, it was very clear that that it is much more complicated than we thought, because there was all of this question about, for example, the ethics of people being research, deciding what research to be part of is important, but also being participant of research, and also being hugely impacted of it, because the small habit that every person has impact on it, it already emerged from the conversation. And then we also started to use a science fiction story to kind of immerse the people in the environment, and we evolved the story over time every time we run the workshop, which kind of gave us a tool of exploring how different concepts evolve for different communities, cultures, groups, and disciplines. We run another series of workshop on an exoplanet. An exoplanet is a planetary system outside the solar system. TRAPPIST-1 is actually a real one, and we chose it because they speculated that it has an Earth-like planet and some tidal lock one. Tidal lock means that one side is always toward the star, one side is away of it. Sorry, away from it, and it causes extreme temperature. And helps in the conversation about climate change. We did the same thing. We have run it for different places, from performance art to space sciences to medicine in different countries, and kind of let the story evolve over the time. And we could already see that brought on some interesting, unexpected conversations about future and climate change. One thing I would say is that as we move away more from Earth, people are more open to have unusual ideas. As we are closer to Earth, like on Mars, people like to be more grounded. We also run a different kind of, like, the Future Earth storyline, which was actually started. Pam run the workshop in Philippine around if we had a future that's fully flooded, and asking the architectures, rather than seeing flooding as a transition thing, to fully embrace it and build buildings that would exist in the flooded area. And we took the story back to UK and other places and evolved it further. And the main context of the tension was the issue about flooding. So as you see, it's we're not intending to predict future, but we're trying to rehearse different futures to familiarize people what futures would look like. Also discuss some of the dynamics and issues and partnership around it, but also make it more possible for people to actually believe in different futures. I use the word believe because one of the things I observed is that, so if in all of the worlds there is some kind of inequalities sometimes happen, because like some planets have more resources than others, some people have skills than others, but we were very careful not to impose any power differences in this scenario ourselves. Like we would we would acknowledge that there are different differences, but we would not use a language that implies which of this group has more power over the others. We wouldn't say, and we even going as far as we would give people names that are not gender specific, are so complicated that it's unlikely people make a gender assumption around them. And despite the fact that we did that, people would still create inequality in the society, probably most of the time, which was always surprising for me, and always raised the question for me. Sorry, I meant they always cause an inequity in the society, not inequality. But which was always surprising for me, that if none of us can imagine a world that doesn't have inequity in it, how can we strive for it? But I would kind of discuss a bit more about some of the things we observed there. So one of the other things we observed was that always our assumption of, when we try to create different futures, people start to make assumptions that are unexpected or branch out of it. And at the beginning, I was trying to stop it, but then I realized that actually is very important to immerse yourself. And we have seen it in different scenarios in the last few years, for example, during COVID pandemic, that when people are immersed with a tension or a problem, they start responding to it differently, and it's not always predictable. Like in this case, we had somebody who picked up a hobby from one of the when we made the immersive scenarios, one of the people had the hobby of like making different teas, and the person made that the central part of solving a health problem on the planet because they assumed that these are connected. And that's how actually reality of society works. The other, like another kind of example of a workshop that we had a kind of tension, a partnership, was we actually made a storyline about Europa, that there was people in the future, that people, some people went to Europa, the planet of Jupiter, build a new society there, lost contact with Earth, and then people on Earth kind of 100 years afterward went there, and became a very different type of people, and they had to refine how they become, how they are similar, how they had to find out that they're humans again. And actually, the joke about fart that led to his love story was one of the things people pointed out, which was very obvious, is that we all have similar body functions, and there are certain very basic things that we have similar. Maybe we should start there to find out that we are the same. I recognize and acknowledge that, rather than going for the more culture aspect of the conversation. We also had a situation that some of the people, we had a storyline that people assume that the planet is a living being and how they connect with the planet, and build a relationship with it or not. There was a poem written to the planet. But it kind of, yeah, it kind of highlighted the important aspect of um, that it kind of opened up the imagination and the conversation about what tools we can use to build a partnership between two stakeholder groups that they usually didn't explore before. So when we did the evolution of the Trappist story across the Europe, and then going to like a space university, which is diverse countries, to going to Philippines, and then go back to Europe, and then go back to Malaysia and Japan. One thing that really struck me was that the storyline when we started in Europe and then took it to Philippines, the first thing Filipinos said that this society is too susceptible to colonization. And then they said, oh, the this whole self-improvement and ambition for becoming better that was integrated in the storyline, the students in Philippines felt like it sounded like an addiction, an obsession, rather than an ambition. And that was quite interesting to see how our own value system affect us, how we imagine the different type of futures. And we had to start exploring how we bring in conversational colonization in the storyline, and give them a possibility for people to explore different ways on how to manage and respond to them. Um, Again, in this scenario, when we had the flooding one, which started in Philippines and then we brought in UK, this one the future Earth was. The interesting one was when we brought the storyline to Europe, the students in UK couldn't immerse themselves in the flooded scenario. Despite the fact we were talking about the future of Earth, this was very um, unbelievable for them that it could be we could be living in an environment that that it could be that badly flooded, and how to respond to that, which also kind of raises the issue that um, who is dominating, who is centering our imagination of the future. And if we are not able to imagine even the more diverse future, how can we prepare or respond to them? Which brings me to the first recommendation. I think, from my point of view, we need to use this participatory methods to both unravel some of the ethical tensions that some of this crisis might create, but also understand how our current the current dominant narrative around what the future should look like might be negatively affecting our ability to respond to the future crisis, because we cannot even imagine a different type of more inclusive future. My also second one is we need to have more co-develop better ethical toolkit. We actually in our research team tried to do that, and there are examples of it in the paper. We have put it, like we have built toolkit about how to engage with the multi-ethnic group, which we work with people in Malaysia, which is a very multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic community. We work like with people from geography to understand how do we contextualize engagement of part of stakeholders if the spatial context has a big role about who they are and how they engage with different topics. And yeah, that's my final word. Apologies with all of the coughs. I tried to do it a few times, but I always ended up coughing at some stage. Any questions? I'm sure either if I manage to be online or my colleague Pam could be able to respond to it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mona. We have, I think, three very interesting intersecting presentations to think about together. And we're joined on the stage by Mona's colleague from the University of Philippines, Pamela Cahileg. And Pamela will do her best to address questions that are directed towards Mona's presentation. But if you have any others, you saw her email address. So we heard a kind of conceptual theoretical vision for how to go about reimagining partnerships into the future, a kind of a starting point, a framework to think through of decoloniality. We then heard Prakriti offering some insights into how perhaps a particular actor, right, can be reimagined in its function and accountability, et cetera, the role of funders. And then Mona's presentation really offering a method or an approach to stimulate imagination in a way that's kind of quasi-Rawlsian, right? Kind of putting people into a space where they can kind of veil themselves to an extent towards the inequities. But as you heard from her, people still can really imagine a society without those inequities in a way. So interesting, I think, for us to think about, and lots of maybe questions that have come forward for you as you heard these talks. So we have, I think, 20 minutes or so before we go to our breakouts. So we'll invite questions and comments from it. Yeah, sorry, the light is.
Hello. Thank you to all the presenters. I was not expecting to hear about sci-fi and farts in this conference. But there you go. Always good to be surprised. I guess my question is for Nadia. Thank you so much. When we think in terms of decoloniality, can you please tell us a bit more about, in the ecosystem of research, how would this link with collective action by different actors? And listening to your presentation, I was really thinking on the opportunity to link African and Latin American researchers and institutions, because we really, really share similar problems. Thank you so much.
Should I go ahead?
Go ahead, yeah.
Thank you very much for that. And again, yes, different people have experienced colonization in different ways. And some of the things, for instance, in our work that we are doing is try to learn from the experiences of others and also find out ways by which we can work together. But the core of it is that there are the basic elements of coloniality that are common amongst us, things around imposition, things around extraction, which we have experienced, but we experience it in different ways. And so the same way in moving forward decoloniality within our research ecosystems is also very contextual, to also learn from how we can turn around or, for instance, unpack and dismantle the indicators of those legacies within our context, first of all, and then within our collective context, and seek ways to move forward collectively towards it. Because we do share in global health, for instance, even though we have our contextual issues, we do share some common principles, common goals as well. So that's the way that I would recommend that we go. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Mike.
So I'm going to try and use my voice again. So I'm really interested. This question, I guess, is for Nadia. So as I said yesterday, my approach to ethics is very contextual, and I'm very understand are very committed to decolonization. My question, though, is whether, as part of that, we really need to give up on the idea of objective truth. So, for example, we're all here in this room because we believe that there is serious global health injustice in the world. That's true. We also think that equity matters. Now, that's true in a different kind of way, but I think that's true. So I just wonder whether actually in order to decolonize, we don't actually need some objective truths.
Thank you for that. And that's a really good and tricky question in that it needs a lot of reflection on that. But what I'll say for that is there are several things that we've institutionalized. And again, I was talking about single viewpoints and accepted as a single viewpoint. So for instance, the issues we all, and we've even talked about it here, about the labels, North-South, about LMIC, HMIC, and sometimes we change because we think that it's not appropriate. And one of the arguments of a colleague was, okay, let's use LMIC because it talks about income levels, which is quantitative. But again, who decided on what was the poverty level? And even the definition or conception of poverty. And so when you dig into it, it becomes something that is debatable based on the context. For instance, health, we can all agree on what health is. But again, if we go into different contexts, what does health really mean for a community in northern Ghana, for instance? What does health mean? It's not an absence of pathogens. It may mean the health of their animals. And so, again, yes, we should be really mindful of what we call objective truths and try to assess what it means within context to different people so that we can come out with ways by which we can practice equity or equitable partnerships. Thank you.
Thanks. I wonder if I could, while we look for other hands in the room, maybe ask Prakriti a question about your reciprocal accountability framework, which I thought was really interesting. This is a challenging question, but communities was in the bottom corner of that cycle. And it seemed like you were engaging with communities in a way that suggested that it wasn't reciprocal in relation to the community, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's a way in which a community needs to be held accountable, or mechanisms within communities of accountability that could be tapped into in order to inform the whole cycle of accountability. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that, about what is the role of the community in that cycle?
Yeah, I think when we think about how communities play a role in research partnerships, that's often something that's left out of our discussions. And I wanted to sort of have an opportunity to dig into that further. The way that I imagine that communities in accountability is that there are structures within communities, that can help hold researchers and funders accountable. But at the same time, when we think of the role of a community, they are also accountable to the individuals of the communities that they live in, and thinking about who are they representing and who are they negotiating for, or who are they ultimately hoping to impact. So I think, and I don't think those are the only three actors in partnerships. I think throughout this convening, we've talked about lots of different actors. So I think, I think we have to be more imaginative about how, as Mona was saying, about how we think about these mechanisms. Yep.
Thank you. Well, congratulations. I think thinking about the futures, I remember that in summer school right now in Cape Town 2 months ago, we also have a roundtable about the future of bioethics. So my Question goes to Nadia. Nadia, I completely agree. I am very interested in your discussion. In Latin America, we also have a very strong discussion about decoloniality. This coloniality is a bit different. Contra-coloniality, there are many different terms in this kind of umbrella of decolonization. So, taking a Frantz Fanon perspective, so it's difficult to deal with this because the coloniality format our minds, our way of thinking, our rationality. So it's a big challenging how we can identify our origins. If you think in a country like Brazil or Argentina, there's no original language in our country in hegemonic perspective. So the genocide of original people was so violent, and when you cannot have the language, you cannot have the culture. I think that is worse than kill bodies, because you kill the culture. And so for me, it's how you think about the interculturality, how we can manage the West, the good side of West contribution or rationality with our perspective in terms of decoloniality. So I would like to hear from you this kind of challenging. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and you are very right. And I think in presenting or discussing or reflecting on these principles, it is also not to say to throw away everything that is external and just go back to it. But I guess to go to the core of the matter is, and I think one of the principles that I presented presents that to answer your question, pluriversality. So we are not saying that the single dominant viewpoint that has replaced the other viewpoints should be thrown out of the window, but that all ways of knowing and doing are equally valid, including the ones that have been silenced over time. And so it's up to us as part of our decolonial action to draw out some of those viewpoints, those traditions, those ways of knowing and doing that over time, because of colonial structures and because of some of the practices and systems have delegitimized some of them. And so to draw them out and ensure that they are all valid and should be considered in the way we do research and the way we live and in the way we manage our affairs. Thank you.
Can I weigh in on this as well? So there are a lot of critiques of decoloniality. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of that. One is how it essentializes and homogenizes our experiences as like a Brazilian experience or Filipino experience. And it also sometimes signposts an essentialized view of culture, as if culture is an onion that if you peel, all these layers away, peel speaking English away, or peel an affinity for films produced in Europe or North America, then somehow you get into this pure core of this unadulterated culture, which is essentially colonial, still colonial in nature, like the noble savage concept. So some scholars find it more, I suppose, analytically potent to use anti-colonial versus decolonial, because then you don't, it's not a layer that you can peel off. But you do resist, forms of oppression, forms of dominance. And another critique is it really does not look at individual actors as well. So if I look at my own personal background, my father taught Shakespeare. Does that make me less Filipino? Because I also feel very strongly about, my country. I had the privilege of studying abroad. I came back specifically because I want to solve the problems in my country. So I feel like maybe there is some space to think about anti-coloniality rather than decoloniality, so that we acknowledge, the complex nature of the human experience.
Oh, thanks. Thanks to all the presenters for really illuminating and stimulating presentations. I actually have a question for Prakriti. I was really impressed by the innovative approach you took to analyzing funders. But I couldn't help but thinking, as you were stating, that all of a sudden your data sources started to disappear, and you've actually probably thought that you had a platform of research that was going to extend into the future. So if this is too personal a question, you don't have to answer, but what comes next for you? Because you have an aspiration to actually surface and explore equity in the world of funders, but those words cannot be spoken now in your current, any EDI is like blocked out, which means that not all worldviews are equally valid, because we cannot tolerate a world where you can suppress that. So just some thoughts about where you're planning to go with your future work.
Yeah, thank you for that question. This was definitely a subject of distress during my research, and I think it's sort of helped me think about how to not rely on like structures that exist, but try to think outside of that. And when I started this research process, I was like, yeah, we're gonna make funders the center of all of this, and they'll solve all the problems and hold everyone accountable. And as I was going through my research process, I was like, I don't think that's the right approach. And I think this is an example of exactly why it's not, because funders are also under their own constraints in terms of who they're accountable to and who controls them, whether it's the US government or whether, Gates is accountable to Gates and the board. So we can't rely on the whims of a person, which is why I think kind of the rethinking the accountability for funders and about how we can create systems that hold them accountable to not make these drastic changes that completely disrupt systems are helpful. But also, I think thinking outside of the US, I don't think US is the center of the world, even though it has tried to be. And I think there are lots of funders in other countries, other high-income countries, that are still progressing or like marching towards, what we call principles of partnership equity. I think from doing the discourse analysis, I also kind of figured out what they're saying they're doing is not exactly what they're doing. So I think even with the US funders, with the documents that are erased, if you talk to kind of people working within the organization, they're trying to carry forward these policies even though they can't publicly speak about it. So I think there's some hope, and I think there's lots of ways to imagine things outside of high-income country funders, even though that is kind of the dominant model for research.
I think you missed an opportunity to ask Ross for a job. No, actually, Prakriti's doing great. She's working at Stanford Center for Bioethics at the moment. Yeah. Are there any other comments or questions? Yeah, I see a hand in the middle.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Ivan. I'm from Indonesia. Perhaps just an observation instead of directed question. So I'm echoing what Mike said earlier on decolonialism and objective truth, because honestly, I'm still a bit unsure about decolonialism as a path forward. The way I see it now, it's more of an exit door from colonialism instead of going forward. So I'd like to make that observation that I think going out from a place is a different state than going into somewhere else. And because you said that this is also a complex thing in practice rather than simple in theory, I wonder if it's helpful in practice, to define what colonialism in research partnership is instead of defining what decoloniality is. So in other words, would it be helpful to define what colonialism in research partnership is, instead of defining what decolonialism is not. I think I got it backwards, sorry. In other words, would it be helpful to define what decolonialism is not, instead of defining what, instead of trying to reimagine what is the shape of decolonialism? And so, going back to the Miss from the Filipino, I forgot your name, please, I'm sorry. Is it possible that the right path forward is actually non-coloniality instead of anti-coloniality? Just to link with the other two presenters, maybe an approach taken by the funders, as presented by Prakriti, is already part of the non-coloniality approach, because they've been trying to get away from the imbalance of power. Is it acceptable as a path forward as we carve out the next steps, instead of us trying to bash them that, oh, this is not enough, we should get more from them and equate? Or perhaps on the second recommendation from the paper from Meta-Futurism, can we directly apply the speculative participatory methods to explore the ethical tensions of decoloniality? That's my observation. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll give it to Pamela to answer those questions as a start.
Thank you, Ivan, for your question. So the futures thinking gives the impression that we only think about futures, but futures thinking workshops actually address the connections between the past, present, and future. So, without really parsing out, do we do decoloniality, anti, or non-coloniality? Good futures thinking workshops, a lot time for us to think about the past and how that past affects the present, and what kind of values and structures do we want to change. And then we try to imagine different futures. For me, the immediate practical application of futures thinking is not, because there's a term in design futures that we call prototypes, which is different from prototypes. So prototypes, you create, stories, models, molds of things that are meant to be produced for commercial gain. But prototypes, which is a mixture of provocation and prototype, you create these things, these stories, specifically so that it stimulates discourse about what we want to change and how we want to make things better. To your latter point on, is there practical application of this? Yes, there is a practical application of this. UNESCO has 26 futures thinking labs around the world. It's being adopted in policy discussions by UNDP, ADB. In the Philippines, we are using futures thinking at the local government level to rethink the relationships of local governments along rivers. So futures thinking for river futures. So there are really different ways to do futures thinking. The ones that Mona and I do are called more like design futures. So it really takes advantage of art, creative approaches to identify futures. It works very well with, say, design school. So I'm based in an architecture school, and we do it a lot in architecture. But there's also another side of futures thinking, which is called strategic foresight, and this is where the policy discussions take place, and it usually entails people in an organization identifying what we call signals of change. It could be a Facebook post or a white paper, anything that can tell us that a thread for a possible future is opening. And then there are discussions on how important these signals are, what do we prioritize, shifts in financing, shifts in, types of governance. So yeah, there are a lot of practical applications. It's just that it's a short presentation, so we had to focus on the more design-based ones.
All right. Thank you. Just to add briefly to that on your comment. So the first one being the fact that it is not a way forward, but is an exit. And I think Pamela alluded to that you need to understand the past to know the future. When we started the session yesterday, we were taking through the historical context to help us understand. And so it's important to do that. And decoloniality is an entryway or an entry point for assessing the current systems within which we operate to be able to now reimagine what we do. And then there was a comment also on definition, defining what it is not rather than what it is, or even if what it is and what it is not. And without attempting to do that, because when the network, Decolonization and Global Health Research, got together, members of which are here in the room, one of the things that we sought to do is not to assume that we understand what it means. So it's starting to unpack, because there have been a few publications or discussions around what different people think it means, but to try to unpack it to the core elements of what colonization did, not just in terms of territorial, but in terms of, things like, imposition, removal, or extraction and things like that. And then seek to understand it, first of all, learning from the broader system, but then more so to global health research, or health research for that matter. Even the issue of what global health came up. And so the last thing I'd like to say to that is that we shouldn't be hung up. We should be careful not to be hung up on definitions, but then to understand what we want to, where we want to get to. So for instance, we are talking about equitable partnerships and how some of these concepts, some of these understandings that we are becoming more and more aware to can help us get there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm give Caesar the last word over there in the corner, and then we have a few administrative reminders.
Okay. No, I mean, if time is up, I mean, I'm happy to shut up. Okay. You want me to? Okay.
Go ahead.
So since I was part of the decolonization network, I thought I'd weigh in on this conversation. I think Nadia, one of the points that Nadia made, which is quite important, is that she's not talking about decolonialism, but coloniality. And coloniality is different to colonialism, because coloniality is the system that was put in place by the colonizers. And this is no longer addressed at the colonizer, but at looking at the structures that allow colonialism to be able to exist and to perpetuate itself even after the departure of the colonizers. And since we're looking at changing systems, the approach is towards decoloniality. And there's a Ghanaian philosopher who writes about this, Kwesi Wiredu, and his idea is that it is not about getting rid of the colonizer and the system, but he says it is about the undue influences. So what was taken away and what was subtracted, because actually the specific evil of colonization is not slavery, it's not extraction, but it is subtraction of agency. So restoring that agency, which I think is important for, research, so respecting different types of knowledges and all that. And if we're talking about equitable partnerships, I think epistemic equity is important. And anyway, we can argue about anti-colonial, decolonial, neo-colonial, post-colonial, post-colonial. There are all these things. But anyway, I think the message is quite clear. It's about the undue. And then the interesting question Mike raised about objective truth. If I may say something about that, is actually, no, I'll do it with an example. The Queen is dead, Queen Elizabeth. That's an objective truth. But in defining any objectivity, what is objective appears to a subject. And therefore, if I say the Queen is dead, what it means to perhaps somebody who's a royalist is different to somebody who is not, or is an anti-royalist. So even in defining objectivity, there is always the position of the subject that defines the objective. So there is no objective that is detached it is always attached to some subjectivity. And I think one of the errors in our way of thinking philosophically is it comes from Aristotle, who says that relation is an accident, and there are essences that can exist without relations. And I think Aristotle was wrong there.
That's a first. Well, we're objectively over time, and you may feel subjectively good or bad about it, but it's where we are. So let's thank our panelists first. Yeah, thank you.